Hello everyone, welcome to today's live stream where we're going to be talking about methods and functions in Python. Over the past few lectures, we've spoken about Python object and data structure, where we talked about the introduction to data types in Python. We've also talked about Python comparison operator, where we looked at working with different greater than, less than, and some comparison operator, and or, and so on and so forth, right? Moving forward, we also talked about Python statements, which we covered if statements, else statements. We also covered the while loop and also the for loop. Um, so if you have not watched that lecture, please do well to watch that lecture, because everything that we've treated in the previous classes is going to be what we're going to be laying foundations on as we move on with the classes, all right? So in today's class, we're going to be talking about functions and method in Python. And without any further ado, let's get started with today's video, all right? So quickly, I'm going to go jump right into my notebook right now. I'm going to go ahead to create a new folder, right? So for this folder, I'm going to notification from WA folder for this. Okay, so for this folder, I'm going to name it O3, right? I'm gonna name it methods, and let's put dash, and so and functions, right? Very good. So now, inside this method and function, we're going to name a new file, a new notebook, right? And this notebook, I'll just name it O1 methods, right? Because this is what we're going to be talking about first, right? So the first one is going to be O1 dash method, right? This is the first one, all right? So if you don't know what methods are, I'm going to explain everything in a bit. So if you don't know what methods are, if you don't know what functions are, I'm going to be explaining it very soon. So previously we've actually talked about methods in Python, and we've also talked about functions also in Python, right? Briefly, right, we did some basic example, right? So basically, what are methods in Python, right? So we've seen few examples of methods in Python while we were learning about object data structure. Remember back then when we were working with lists and we wanted to append to a list, you remember we used some basic methods right then, right? So those are the methods in Python actually. Those are the basic methods in Python. And basically my methods are essential in function, right? So sorry, methods are very essential in Python, right? So now just take a look at these two scenarios. We have methods and we have functions, right? So methods are just some block of reusable codes in Python that has been written down already for us to make our life easier, right? So, and basically, method perform specific actions or specific instructions. So, for example, you can say if you have a list and you want to add a new item to the list, you are going to go ahead to use a method that is already written down in Python to add an item to a list. All right, you know there are different ways of adding adding a an item to a list, right? So for example, you can say you want to assign a new item to a list, and it's going to be added to the last item in that list of array that you've created. All right. So but in Python, they are already inbuilt methods for us that we can go ahead to use. And how do you go ahead to use methods in Python, right? So the basic example of how you write methods in Python is so let me just turn this to a markdown cell, right? So you have something like your object, right? Your object dot method, right? Basically it can have like argument one, it can have argument two, and so on and so forth, right? So this is how basically, so let me write methods here so you guys can know that we're talking about methods here, right here. So methods, exclamation mark one, I'm turning to markdown, so sorry. All right. Please kindly confirm if you can hear me very well from the comment section. All right. Precious, Amid, Smart, good morning. How are you guys doing today? All right. So this is how you basically use methods in Python, right? So for example, let's take a look at this example right now. We have lists. We have a list. So let's say we have a list, and I'll still this list is equals to, and I'll just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So we have this list in Python, right? And in Python you can basically do different, there are multiple methods that you can work with in in Python, right? So for example, if I want to, let's say I want to add a new item to the list, right? So how to add a new item to the list? How do I do this? You do lst, right? And what you just say lst.append, right? And you say append, let's say 6, right? So if I run this cell and I go ahead to check my list, you can see that we're going to have what, 6 added to a list, right? So this dot append right here are the methods that we have in Python, right? So now what I want you to know is there are multiple methods that you can use in Python, right? So what you should use, you should do is you should go to your browser, right? And just search for methods in Python, right? And we're going to be using W3 schools because that's the documentation that we're using throughout, right? Okay, very good. So if I say methods in Python, and I click on this list, you can see that we have like multiple. Python has a set of built-in methods that you can use on lists, right? So you can see we have dot append, we have dot clear, we have copy, count, and so on and so forth, right? And you can actually try it out if you want to try it out, right? Let's just do another example quickly. So basically, methods are very simple to use, right? You just have to know what you want to do, and you can do a quick Google search, you can read documentation, and so on and so forth, right? So one thing that you should know about methods is you can actually go ahead to check what the method does, right? So now let's look at another example. So now let's say we have something like we want to do lst dot count, right? So now let's say that we want to, so I took this count from, let's say we want to do something like count, right? For this one. So let's say we don't know what count is at first, right? So we don't know what count does, we don't know what count is, we are just hearing it for the first time, right? How do you go ahead to use how do you go ahead to know that, sorry, how do you go ahead to know that you want to, how do you go ahead to know what count is used for, right? So what you can do is when you come to your code, right, once you have written your methods or your object that you want to perform a method on, right? So I'm saying dot count here, and inside this parenthesis, you can click on Shift tab on your system, right? So what it does is Python helps you to it helps give you a detailed information on what that method is about, right? So for example, you can see that the what it does is it return number of occurrence in of value, right? So that means if we pass in a value right here, it's going to tell us the total time it appears in that object or in that list, right? So for example, if I come here and I say, okay, let me pass 2, for example, right? So it's going to say that it's going to count how many times 2 occurs in this list, right? So if I call it to run this, you can say that it's saying 1, right? But let's say we append something, another 2 to this list. So I'll say list.append, right? And I'll say 2, right? And I'll run this cell and I'll say LST again. You can see that we now have 1, 2, right? So now let's check how many 2s again that we have in the list. So LST dot count, right? I'm going to say 2 here. And you can see that now it's returning 2, right? So basically it's going to help you a lot, especially if you don't know what that particular method is about before, and you are just new to it and you want to check out what the method does. You can click, right? So let me just write it down for you guys. So you can press Shift plus Tab on your system to get more info about a method, right? But if you also want to look at more detailed information about the object or about the method rather, what you can do is you can say help, right, into parentheses, and you can just say lst dot count, right? So what this does is it's going to give you the information on what the count is, right? So for example, you can see help on built-in function count, right? So you can see that it's saying built-in functions, right? So now, what are functions in Python? We're going to look at it in our next in the next thing that we'll be learning now, right? But just know that I said it before actually that there are a bunch of reusable code that has been built for us already in Python, right? So we don't need to stress ourselves on saying that we want to add list, we're not going to assign new variable, then add the new item and all of that, right? So these methods are already written in Python for us already that helps us to perform some certain tasks, right? So now, since we already know what built-in functions are, which can also be called method, right? Let's go ahead to look at what functions are, right? So I'm going to go ahead to create a new cell right here, a new notebook rather. And this notebook, I'm going to name it functions, all right? So we're going to be looking at functions in more details. I'm going to pick this kernel because that's the default kernel I've been using since. All right, I'm going to name this O2. I'm going to name it functions, all right? So this is where it gets interesting, right? So remember I said that built-in functions are just bunch of reusable codes. Thank you, Creator, for that. So remember I said built-in functions are bunch of reusable codes. But how about if we want to create our own functions by ourselves? So for example, we want to have like a bunch of reusable code that we want to use to perform some certain tasks later on in the future, right? So that's where function comes in, right? So functions are bunch of reusable codes that get executed only when you call them, right? So what do I mean by this? So for example, if I say that I'm writing a program in my um so let's take a look at the previous exercise that we worked on, right? So previously we worked on an exercise that has to do with guessing game, right? So let me go ahead to open that folder for you guys so that you're going to see what I'm talking about, right? So let me just present my screen right now. So let me go back to Python programming tutorial, and I'm going to go to Python statements and Python statement assessment, right? Because I want you guys to understand what functions are very well. It's very, very important because functions really help when it comes to larger codes, right? Larger code base. You can't be writing codes hundreds of times, right? So for example, let's say that we want to write this code, right? We want to write this code, and what would happen is, for example, if you want to take in so for example, if you want to write this code again, right, what are we going to do? We're going to have to copy it, right? So I want to run this code again in another cell because I want to change some logic. I'm going to have to copy it. I'm going to have to go down below, create a new cell, then paste the code, right? And if I want to do it like 3 times or 4 times, I have to keep copying and pasting, right? So how about if we now have like a house or a structure that we can put this code inside, and whenever we want to use it, we can just call that function, or we can just call that house that we already created, right? So that's how function works. And that's what we're going to be learning in this next lecture, right? So I already told you guys what functions are. So just take a look at it, that functions are a bunch of reusable codes that get executed whenever you call them, right? Remember I said whenever you call them, right? So it's very important because sometimes you might write functions and you might just see that in a way it's not printing out the result, or is not doing what is expected, right? So if you create a function and you do not call it, there's no how the function is going to get executed, all right? So what you can do is, let me create a new header here, and I'm going to name it functions, right? Escape M, right? So how do you create a functions in Python, right? That's something that is very, very important that we have to look at together, right? So the why do we actually need to use function? I did give you guys some basic example, right? Because sometimes you might have to perform some certain tasks over and over again. Sometimes we might have to break our code into smaller chunks so that we can call it over and over again, right? And if you want to read more about functions, just come here. Remember, I sent a note to you guys. You can just come here. You can see the functions in under the W3 school documentation. You can see functions right here. You can click on it and you can basically read through the documentation, right? It's very, very important, right? So you can see a function, a block of code, which only runs when it is called. You see that they actually mentioned it out here also, right? So you can pass data known as parameter into a function, and a function can return data as a result, all right? So since you can go ahead to read more about this also. I think I provided this link in the on the community group, so you can check it out. Also, I'll try to add the link to the description box below so that you can also access it directly from there. All right. So let's continue with our functions right now. So now, how do you create functions in Python, right? So the default way of writing functions in Python is we're going to say something like dev, right? So to define a function, you have to use this keyword def. Very, very important, right? So this def followed by the name of the of your function, right? So for example purpose, I'm going to name this function name underscore of underscore function, right? So now, don't forget, if you want to create a function in Python, the first thing first is you have to use this def keyword, right? After this def keyword, it follows by the name of your function, which can be anything. So for example, it can be maybe add two numbers together. It can be check if a number is even or odd. It can be it can be um function for building a game or whatsoever. It can be anything, right? So for this example case, I'm just showing you how to use it, right? So I'm going to name it name of function, and at the front you have your parentheses, right? So this open and closing parentheses, right? And I'm going to talk more about this later on, right? So followed by the semicolon, then you click enter. Don't forget, once you add semicolon to Python and you click enter, then there's always an indent, right? It's always very, very important, right? And basically what now goes in here is, so I'm going to put a multi-line comment right here, right? 123 slash 123, right? This multi-line comment, in case you don't know what this is, right? So this is where the functions document string goes, right? So where when you can go help on your function, right? It will be printed out, right? So after this, so this string is just where all your functions document string can go in, right? So you can actually, so now if you now want to actually perform some certain tasks, you can now come here to do certain tasks here, right? You can do certain tasks here, and also you can also return a result, right, in functions, right? So this is the basic format of how to create a function, right? So since we already know that this is what we're going to do right now, you just have dev, right, which is the keyword for like if you want to create a for loop, you have to use the for. If you want to create a while loop, you have to use the while, right? So those are keywords in Python, right? And we know what keywords are in Python, right? Keywords are those predefined words already in Python which perform some certain tasks, right? So now, since we already know that this is the template on how we can go ahead to create a function, let's go ahead to actually create an actual function. All right. From India, somebody's joined us from India. That's awesome. Shama, welcome, welcome. All right. So if I come here, right, and I say I want to create a new function right now, so I'm going to say, let's just create a new function to just say hello, right? So I'm going to say in dev, right, def, and I'm going to say hello underscore hello, right? And don't forget, after I say hello, I have to use the parentheses, right? And use semicolon. So semicolon, enter, then it's going to take us to a new indent, right? A new line, right? And there must be indents right there. Don't forget, if you write your function right here, you're going to have error. So you have to put indentation, right? So for this one, I'm going to say print. I'm just going to say print hello Daveworld, right? So and I run this cell. Now you notice that when I ran this cell, what happened? Normally, we were supposed to um we were supposed to so it was supposed to print hello Dave world, right? But you notice that nothing came out, right? Because it's very, very important to take note of this. Functions will never get executed, and I've seen it over and over again, right? Because I noticed that sometimes some beginners used to run into this problem, right, or into this challenge. They will never get executed unless you call them, right? So now, how do I call a function? So to call a function, you just call it by the name of the function that you created. In this example, I said say underscore hello, right? And to call a function, you now have to use the parentheses to call the function, right? So if I call this right now, you can see that it's going to say hello Daveworld. All right. So kindly confirm from the chat if you can hear me very well. All right. This lecture is currently going on from in Nigeria. All right. Shama. All right. So now we have looked at how to create a function. Now, how to create a function and how to call a function. Now, you notice that when I was calling this function, I had to pass in what parentheses right here. If I go ahead to just say underscore hello without calling a function, what Python is going to do is Python is just going to tell you the type of the type of function this is, right? So if I just run this cell, it's going to tell you function underscore main underscore dot say hello, right? So it's just trying to tell you that this name that you passed in here is a function that needs to be called, right? That's what Python is trying to tell you. Now, since we already know how to create a function and how to call a function right now, let's look at how we can actually go ahead to pass in parameters or arguments to the function. All right. So there are two things you need to know here, something that is called parameter and something that is called argument. All right. So let's go ahead to do search for what these are, right? Because when you are writing code in Python, something that is very, very important that I would like you guys to always do is to know how to make use of Google search very well, right? I don't just want to come here and just teach you guys and you guys are just going to go like that. It's not going to be proper, right? So I want you guys to know how to search for a particular task in case you need help, because that will be very, very important when you are working for complaints, all right? Or when you are working on a particular project or a task, right? So let's open a new tab and I'm going to search for what are arguments in Python, right? So for example, let's say we don't know what arguments are or what parameters are in Python. Let's go ahead to read more about it, right? So in Python, arguments are valued passed to a function when it is called, right? They provide the necessary input for the function to perform its operation. This is an AI overview, right? So let's look at what Google is saying, right? So the terms parameter and arguments can be used for the same thing, right? But to be honest, I would say there's a clear difference between parameters and arguments, right? So for example, if you want to use parameters, right? Parameters are what you can pass in into a function when you are trying to define it, right? While argument is what you pass in when you are trying to call it, right? That's what he's saying here, right? But so a parameter is a variable listed inside the parentheses in the function definition, like I said earlier, right? So this can be confusing sometimes, but just pay attention, right? So now let's go ahead to create a new function that has parameter and that has arguments rather. All right. So for example, if I come here and I say dev, right? So let's say dev greet. I'm going to name a function that's named greetings, right? And what is this greeting going to do, right? So this greeting is going to take in a username and it's going to say hello, that particular username, right? So I can say take in a name, right? And right here, I'm going to say print into parentheses. I'm going to say f and I'm going to say hello. Remember f string, right? And I'm going to say the name that is passed, right? So now this name that we passed into this place is known as what? The parameter, right? So I'm going to write it somewhere right here. So name passed into the function is known as the parameter, right? Now, let's run this. Remember, when we run a function, nothing happens unless we call it, all right? So now let's call it. So if I say greetings, right? So greetings, and don't forget here I now have to pass in the variable name, which is called what? Argument. So arguments are data passed into a function when it's being called, right? So now we can pass in a data right here. So I can say, let's say I want to say hello Daveworld, right? Or let's just say hello Dave. If I run this cell, you can see that now that it's saying hello Dave, right? So for example, at the I want to say hello Dave, hello Amid, hello Preshi. I would have to be saying print hello Dave, print hello Preshi one by one, right? But if I want to call it again, I can just say greetings, right? And I'm just going to pass in right here. I'm going to pass in Preshi, right? And if I run this now, you can see that it's showing hello Preshi, right? So now you can see how functions can be useful for us. Instead of us writing some bunch of code over and over again, we can just have it inside a function and we can just call that function whenever we need it. All right. So now that we already know how to pass in argument and parameters, we know the key difference between parameters and arguments. Parameters are passed when you are basically defining your function, while arguments are passed when you are calling your function. That's why they said sometimes right here it can be used as the same information, right? But they have key difference, right? That's one thing you should know about functions and parameter. All right. So let's go back to our code, right? So now that we have already seen this in place, let's look at how we can actually return a value, right? So for example, let's say that we want to perform some certain operations, and once we are done, we want to go ahead to return the answer of the operation that we performed, right? So now let's create a function that basically adds some numbers together. So I'm going to say dev, right? And I'm going to name this function add underscore num, right? And into parentheses, I'm going to say it's going to take in two two parameters, right? So the parameter one is going to be num1 and the next one is going to be num2, right? So you can also see parameters as a variable that you're passing inside a function, right? And right here, I'm just going to say return return num1 plus, or you know what? Let's just say before we return, let's just say add is equals to num1 num1 plus num2, right? And I'm going to say return add. So what this does is it's saying that whatever value the user pass in into this function, you should go ahead to add the two numbers together and it should return the results. That's what I'm trying to say here, right? So let's go ahead to run this cell and now let's call our function, right? So I'm going to say add underscore num, and right here I'm going to pass in two numbers that I want to add together, right? Let me just say I want to add 2 and 3, right? So if I run this cell, don't forget this is the argument right here. If I run this cell, we can see now that it's returning 5, right? So now we have a function that we can use to add two numbers together, and right here I'll pass in another argument of, let's say, 10 and 45, and you can see that it's going to help us to add the numbers together automatically. All right. So now one common thing that I usually see beginners confused with return is also the print statement. All right. So for example, right here, if you also want to store it inside a new variable, so let's say for example you want to store whatever value that the user adds in number to a new variable, you can also say you can create a new variable that say results. Let's say results is equals to add into parentheses, sorry, add underscore num into parentheses, right? I should do visit India sometimes. All right, I will, if I have the opportunity to. All right, so if I have this add number together and I'm going to pass into two new arguments, and I'm going to do 5 and let's just say 7, right? So and I run this, and now I can go ahead to print right, I can print results. And if I print results, you see that we have what? 12, right? Because 5 plus 7 is 12, right? So now what happened if we use two input string rather? So for example, let's say we do something like add underscore num into parentheses. Now and I can use two string like maybe 1 and I say comma 2. What would happen? Obviously you should know that when you are using plus in Python and is a string, it's going to what go ahead to what concatenate the values together, right? So now if I go ahead to run this cell, you can see that we're going to have what? 1, 2, because normally if we have a parenthesis of 1 plus, and we have another one of 2, normally it's going to print out what? 1, 2, normally, right? So if you pass in two string as a parameter, obviously it's going to go ahead to print out what? The concatenated version of that argument that you passed in, right? Now, it's a very common question that I believe you guys should have, which is, what is the difference between escape b dot equal to a new cell below? What is the major difference between a print statement and a return statement, right? So now let's take a look at it together, because it's very, very important, and sometimes it can be confusing, right? So I'm going to create a new function. I'm going to say dev. So let me just say very common question is what is the difference between return and print, right? What is the difference between return and print, right? Escape m. I'm going to run this cell, right? So now let's create a new function right now. Let's just say, you know what? Let me just add some new function. Let me add comments to you guys, so that you guys can understand what we are doing when you are reading the lecture. So I'm just going to say, define a function. Or you know what? Let me just say defining. I'm going to say defining a function, right? And yeah, I'm going to say calling a function, or let me just say function call, right? So that when you guys are going through the notebook, you're going to know what you're doing, right? So yeah, I'm also defining a function with that accepts, that takes in parameter, right? Mm. And here we're what? Calling function call um with function call passing an argument, right? Very good. So that when you guys are going to the notebook, you're going to understand what's going on. So now let's address this major difference between return type, return and print, right? So let's say we have this function dev, and I'm going to name this print underscore results, right? So normally how we define our function, and here I'm just going to say print, and let's just take in some default parameters. Actually, let's take in a comma b, and here we'll just say print a plus b, right? Right here too, let's take another function. Let's create another function. So let's run this cell actually, and here let's create another function, right? All right, I hope you guys can hear me very well. So let's create another function, and here I'm going to name it dev. I'm going to say return underscore results, right? I'm going to name this a. I'm going to pass in a parameter here, a comma b, right? I'm going to do this, and I'm going to say return a plus b. Now, what is the difference between these two, right? Don't forget, our function, nothing is going to happen right now because we have not gone ahead to call it, right? So now what's going to happen within these two, right? So now let's check it out. So let's say print, let's just say print underscore results, right? Print underscore results, and I'm going to pass in two parameters right here, two arguments rather, right? So that's why you saw that argument and parameters can be used interchangeably, because sometimes it does tend to mess up with your head, right? But once you're passing parameter to the function call, then once you're passing a variable to the function call, then that's your argument, right? So I'm going to say 10 comma let me just say 5 right now. So if I run this, you can see it's going to give me what? 15, right? It's printing out the value 15. Let's also do return underscore results, right? And I'll pass in two arguments right here, and I'm going to say, let's say 20 comma 10, and you can see it's giving me 30. Now take note of this. look at when I call this print underscore result, you can see that it's not returning a a cell number, right? So that means that this is actually getting printed out. But you can see that right here is returning 30. That means normally this is not supposed to get printed out because we are using Jupyter Notebook. So if you are doing, so let me just write the comments right here for you guys. So I'm just saying you won't see any output if you run this in a .py script, right? So now, why am I saying this? Remember in our introduction lecture, when we're doing 1 plus 1, right? You can see that normally it's going to get printed out. But normally, if you do this 1 plus 1 in Py script, you're not going to see the output right here, right? But if I do print into brackets 1 plus 1, you can see that it's going to what? Print this out normally, right? So that's what you should take note of, that normally if you're using return statements and you just call the function, normally you're not supposed to see your results, but Jupyter Notebook is just displaying it for us. So this is not going to get executed in a .py script, right? Because when you start doing larger code, you might be thinking, oh, I did return statements and I'm not getting my output back, right? So that's because normally you're not supposed to get your output if you're using return statements, right? But what actually happens if we want to save the result later for use, like what we did here, right? So let's say, for example, we want to go ahead to save the result later, like what we did right here, right? Remember, I wanted to do something like this. So let's say, how about if I want to do something like that again, right? So I can say, can you define return? What do you mean by can you define return? Non-stop gaming, all right? So for example, if I want to say my underscore result is equals to return. So let's call this function first. Return result, right? Return results. And right here, I'm going to pass in two parameters, two arguments rather. I'm going to say, let's say 30, 20, right? And I run this and I say my underscore results, right? You can see we're getting 50, right? You can see we're getting 50, right? So now, if I now go ahead to say, okay, let me try this out with the print results function, right? So I'm going to say print underscore results, right? It's equals to you know what? Let's name it my result also, right? Um, my underscore result two, right? My result two will be equals to result. Sorry, it will be what? Print result rather. So I'll say print result, right, into parentheses, right? And yeah, I'm going to pass in two parameters. I'm going to pass in, let's say 10. I'm going to pass in, let's say, just 5, right? So if I go ahead to run this cell, it's equals to 2. You can see that right here, it gets printed out 15, right? But now, if I go ahead to say my underscore result 2, right? What happens? Nothing gets printed out, right? Now, that's because normally we are not returning a value, we are just printing the value, and that's what got printed out here when we called it, right? So now, if we check type, of my results one, my results, right? You're gonna see the type right here. You can see it's telling you that the return type is a what? Integer. But if you check the type, right, of what? Of my result two, you see that it's telling you that it's a non-type. That means that um you did not return any value, right? So that's one thing you should take key note of is when you are working with functions and you want to return results, you have to use the return keyword, right? um and you can't define a return, you just use the keyword return and followed by what you want to return at the front, basically non-stop gaming, all right? So if you want to return a result, it's very, very important to use this return statement. But if you know that you don't want to return any type or any value, you can just use this print, right? So now that we already know this key difference between these two, because these are some basic things that you need to know as a beginner, let's go ahead to look at how we can work with functions and some certain logic, right? So let's look at how we can, so we can adding, let's say, logic to internal function operation, right? I'm gonna do escape M. I'm gonna run this, all right. So I'm just saying we're trying to add a logic to our function that we're creating, right? So let's say that we want to run a function that checks if a number is even. Remember, how do we know if a number is even, right? So if that number, let's say the number is 10, if that number modulus 2, right, is equals to modulus 2 is equals to 0, right? That means it's an even number, right? So let's run 10 modulus 2. Obviously, it's an even number, but if we do, like, let's say 9 modulus 2, obviously we know it's an odd number, which is 1, right? So whatever number modulus 2 that gives you 0 is an even number, and if the remainder gives you 1 is an odd number, right? If you don't know what modulus is, we've talked about it over and over again in our previous lecture, so do well to revisit us to understand what I'm talking about very well, all right? So now you can see why I said that you have to understand the fundamentals very well, so that when we get along with the course, I'm just going to be saying this and I'm just going to be going along, because I already assume you guys already understand what we did in our previous class already, all right? So now let's define a function that checks if a number is even or odd, right? So write a function that checks if a number is even, right? So let's just do is even first, just for simplicity, right? So I'm going to say even. I'm going to name this even check, right? Into parentheses, and this even check is going to take in a parameter, right? Which is the number it's going to check for, right? And for this, I'm going to return number, right? Number divisible by 2 equals to 0. Now, what's it going to return for us, right? Because we are trying to return if the number modulus 2 is equals to 0, then obviously this is going to tell us if it's true or false, right? So let's confirm this. So if I come here and I do A and I do this, um sorry, if I say let's just say for this example case, I'll say our number is equals to, let's say, 10, right? So you can see that's going to return what's true for us, right? If I say our number is equals to 9, it's going to return false. So that's what's going to happen right here also, right? So I'm going to go ahead to run this function, right? And right here, I'm going to go ahead to call the function right now. I'm going to say even underscore check. I'm going to pass in a parameter right here. And the parameter I'm going to pass in here is, let's just say 20, right? So you can see it's returning true. And if we say even underscore check, uh, and we pass in, like, let's say 17, it's going to return what? False, because if it's not, because 17 is an odd number, obviously, right? But how about if we want to check if a number is actually even or odd at the same time at once, right? So now let's just say check if any number i- any number in a list, or let's just say check if a number is even or odd, right? And what I'm going to do right here, I'm going to say def, and this def is going to do what? Check underscore even underscore odd underscore number, right? And what it's going to do is going to take in a parameter, right? A parameter of norm. You can name it norm, or let's just name it number, so you guys understand very well. All right. So I'm going to name this number, and right here I'm just going to create a new cell below so you guys can see my screen very well. So I'm going to say check for even or odd number, and I'm going to say if that number, right, if that number modulus 2 is equals to 0, right? And we're just going to say print. We're going to use f string right here, and we'll just say the number that you inputted, right, is an even number, right? And else, obviously, it's going to be an odd number. We're just going to say print, right? And here we're going to say f string, and I'm also going to pass in what number, right? I'm going to say is an odd number, right? And if I go ahead to run this cell and I go ahead to do call this function, right? I'm going to call this function, and if I pass in an argument right here of like 10, you're going to see it's going to say 10 is an even number. If I try to call it again and I say and I just say like 5 rather, it's going to say 5 is an odd number, right? So that's how you can actually check if a number is even or odd using a function, right? So that's basically how you can work with functions in Python. There are various example in about function in Python that I would like you guys to check out. Trust me, you are also going to be given assessments just to assess if you understand what we treated here very well. And if you want to practice more exercise about function before I give you guys my own assessment, and you know how my assessment is normally, right? So just come to Chrome, and what you can do is you can Google search on some exercises about function just to practice more about functions, right? So I'm going to say functions exercise in Python just to task yourself, right? So you can, if you come here, W3 School also has some great exercise. Let's check out W3 Schools, and you can see while we are this is exercise that you can pass through that you can go through, right? So what is the correct keyword for defining function in Python, right? So the correct answer is going to be what? Dev, right? And submit answer, you can say that's the correct answer, right? So you can come here and you can basically practice more question about function in Python, right? You can go to next, click on next, do the remaining exercise, and you'll be good to go, right? And you can also check out some other exercises. It's not only W3 School that are available, but that's what I recommend. You can see 10 Python functions practice exercise for beginners, right? You can check it out, and so on and so forth. And basically, that's how you get better in coding, right? I hope you guys understood what we did today. So today we were able to cover what methods are. So quickly, let me check my system. System is about to go down. All right. So we learned about methods in Python. We saw that methods are okay. So we saw that methods are some bunch of reusable codes that have been built for us already in Python that helps us to perform some certain tasks, right? So for example, I said we have dot append, which helps us to add a new item to a list. We also have dot count, which counts the occurrence of that particular argument that we're passing into the method, right? And we also talked about function. We talked about the introduction to function, how to create a function, how to define a function, how to call a function, right? We also talked about how we can pass in parameters, how we can pass in arguments, and we saw the major difference between parameters and arguments, which is very important. We also saw how to perform some certain logic and how to do um we also saw the difference between the return and the print statement